In the second part of this series, we're going to make a simple movement controller using the keyboard and Unity's new input system. First, we install the new input system from the package manager. Next, we create an empty game object and name it player input. In this player input object, we need to add a component named player input. This component requires an input action, so we create an input action asset by right-clicking in any folder, create input action. Then, we attach this input action in the player input component. Next, we open the input action that we created. Then, we make a new control scheme and let's call it player. We add a keyboard in this list and click save. We also enable the autosave. Next, we add an action map and call it player actions. This automatically adds an action that we're going to rename move. Then, we add a binding by clicking this plus sign and add a 2D vector composite and call it WASD. We also delete this existing default binding because we don't need it. Next, we assign different keys to up, down, left, and right. We click first on up binding and click on this path dropdown. We can press this listen button and press W in the keyboard, then select the choice that appears. We do this for the rest of the directions. After assigning all the keys, make sure you save if you don't check this autosave. We can now close this window. Next, we add the basic character motion using rigid body by adding rigid body component into our character. For now, we're going to disable the gravity for this rigid body component. Next, we create a script to control this rigid body, name it player controller, and open it. In this script, we need to fetch the rigid body component. We want to control this rigid body using velocity, so we define a vector3 velocity and change this velocity somewhere. In the fixed update, we are going to assign this velocity to the velocity of the rigid body. Next, we need to access the input actions that we created. We first add the input system class. Then we create a public function that we will call onMove, and this onMove function will use the callback context. Every time the WASD keys are pressed, this function will be called and the value of the 2D vector composite will be sent to this context variable. We only need to read this context and assign the value to a 2D vector variable. Then we assign this variable to our velocity using simple axis swapping. X movement is X, Y is 0, and Y is Z in 3D. Now we go back to our scene, click on the player input object, and in the player input component, we will change the behavior to invoke Unity events. If we open this events dropdown and open the player actions, we can see the move callback context. But before we can use this, we need to attach the player controller script that we made to our character. Go back to the player input object and open events, player actions. In move, we click this plus sign, and in the object, we drag our character object. If we click this function, we can see the player controller script, and then we select the onMove function that we made. Now we press play, and we can now control our rigid body. In this next part, I'm just going to change the camera view and add the textured plane so we can see our character movements much better. Next, we're going to change the facing direction of our character. We want our character to face in the direction of motion. And to do this, we go to our player controller script, and in the fixed update, we're going to calculate the facing direction, and this is simply the direction component of our velocity. Then we calculate the rotation using look rotation and assign it to the rotation of the rigid body. If we go back to the scene and press play, we can see that the facing direction changes based on the motion of the rigid body. In the final video of this series, we're going to combine the keyboard controls with the animation. See you in the next video.